The night had started as one of those quiet evenings that feel almost perfect without trying too hard. It was late March, and the cold of winter had almost disappeared, leaving the air cool but comfortable. A couple of days had passed since St. Patrick's Day, but the decorations in the Irish pub were still hanging everywhere. Green streamers draped along the walls, small shamrock lights blinking softly above the bar, and a faded Irish flag pinned behind the stage where the musicians were setting up their instruments. My friends and I had planned the night for weeks. There was a small musical act performing that evening, an acoustic group that specialized in traditional Celtic folk songs. The pub was known for hosting them occasionally, and whenever they played, the place had a cozy atmosphere that felt different from the typical noisy bar scene. This pub had two separate areas. The first room was the usual bar space, where people ordered drinks, laughed loudly, and watched sports on a big television. The second room was quieter. It had wooden tables, dim yellow lights, and a small stage at the front where the musicians performed. That second room was where we wanted to be. When we walked in, the place looked exactly how we hoped it would. Only a few tables were occupied. Maybe 3 or 4 groups of people sat scattered around the room. Some couples leaned close together, sipping dark beer while quietly chatting. A couple of older men sat near the stage, nodding along while the musicians tuned their instruments. The band hadn't started yet, but the soft sounds of tuning strings floated through the room. A fiddler adjusted the pitch carefully, a guitarist strummed gentle chords, someone tested a Baharan drum with slow rhythmic taps. It felt peaceful. We grabbed a table near the middle of the room, close enough to hear the music clearly, but not so close that we felt like we were sitting on the stage. "This is perfect," my friend Mark said as he sat down. I nodded. We ordered drinks and settled in, excited for a relaxing night of music. A few minutes later, the musicians started their first song. The fiddle began softly, weaving a melody that felt both cheerful and slightly nostalgic. The guitar followed, steady and warm. Soon, the singer joined in with a traditional Irish folk song that most people in the room seemed to recognize. Heads nodded gently with the rhythm. One couple even held hands across the table while listening. It was exactly the kind of evening we had hoped for. For about 20 minutes, everything stayed like that. Peaceful, comfortable, enjoyable. Then, the door opened. At first, we didn't think much about it. A group of people walked into the room, laughing loudly as they entered. It wasn't unusual for a group to arrive together at a bar, especially one that had just recently celebrated St. Patrick's Day. But within seconds, it became clear that this group was different. There were about 10 or 12 of them, maybe more. They didn't quietly find seats like the other guests had done. Instead, they dragged several tables together, pushing chairs across the wooden floor with loud scraping sounds. The music continued on stage, but the scraping of furniture was loud enough that people started glancing over. The group combined 4 tables into one big cluster. Then they sat down like they owned the place. Drinks arrived quickly, loud laughter followed. At first, it was just normal bar noise, but it didn't stay normal for long. Within minutes, the group became louder than the music. One guy shouted a joke that made half the table burst into exaggerated laughter. Another woman yelled something across the table instead of simply speaking to the person next to her. Glasses clinked loudly, chairs scraped again, and the music started getting buried beneath their noise. I tried to ignore it at first. The band was playing a fast folk tune now, and I focused on the rhythm of the fiddle, trying to stay in the moment. But the rowdy table kept getting worse. One of them suddenly shouted toward the stage, "Just play something we know." A few people at their table laughed. The musicians politely ignored the comment and continued playing. A minute later, someone else yelled even louder, "Hey, that sounded wrong." More laughter. My jaw tightened. Mark leaned toward me and muttered, "Great, one of those groups." I nodded slowly. Anyone who'd spent time in bars knew exactly what he meant. Some groups come to enjoy the atmosphere. Others come just to be loud. And unfortunately, this group clearly belonged to the second category. Their table grew louder with each drink. They weren't even really listening to the music.
Sometimes they would clap randomly in the middle of songs, sometimes they would yell comments at the musicians. One guy kept trying to sing along loudly, but he clearly didn't know the words. At one point, a woman at the table stood up slightly and yelled toward the stage, "You guys know anything upbeat?" The singer politely smiled and said into the microphone, "We'll see what we can do." But the tension in the room was growing. Other guests were clearly annoyed. The couple near the stage stopped holding hands and simply stared down at their drinks. One of the older men shook his head slowly. The peaceful atmosphere we had enjoyed earlier had completely disappeared. The room now belonged to the rowdies. I tried again to focus on the music. The band started a beautiful, slow ballad, one of those haunting Irish songs that tell stories of old sailors and lost love. Normally, a song like that would quiet a room, but not tonight. The rowdy table kept talking through the entire thing, loudly. At one point, someone actually shouted mid-song, "This one's depressing." Their table erupted in laughter again. My patience was disappearing quickly. I glanced toward the musicians. They seemed calm, almost used to this kind of crowd. Bar musicians probably deal with drunk interruptions all the time, but just because they were used to it didn't mean I had to enjoy it. Mark leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Well," he said quietly, "there goes the relaxing night." I didn't answer. Instead, I kept watching the loud table. Something about their behavior really irritated me. It wasn't just that they were loud, it was the way they seemed completely unaware, or maybe completely unconcerned, that they were ruining the night for everyone else in the room. They acted like the music was background noise for their party, not the reason people had come here. Another song started. More talking, more shouting, more heckling. Then something unexpected happened. One of the women at the loud table suddenly stood up. She raised her drink and shouted toward the stage, "I can sing one of those songs." The room fell strangely quiet. The musicians looked at each other. The singer smiled politely. "You want to come up and try?" he asked. Her table exploded with cheers, and she walked confidently toward the stage. That was the moment the night took a turn I never expected, and the moment when the idea for my small, petty revenge first entered my mind. For a moment, the entire room watched the woman as she walked toward the stage. The loud table erupted in cheers, whistles, and exaggerated applause, as if her friend had just been invited to perform at a world-famous concert hall instead of a small Irish pub with creaky wooden floors and dim yellow lights. She seemed to enjoy the attention. She climbed the small step onto the stage with the confidence of someone who had probably been the center of attention many times before. One of the musicians stepped aside to give her space near the microphone. Up close, she looked a little younger than I first thought, maybe early 30s. Her cheeks were slightly flushed from drinking, but she didn't look completely drunk. In fact, she stood fairly steady, adjusting the microphone height while smiling at her cheering friends. "What song do you want to do?" the guitarist asked kindly. The woman leaned into the microphone. "Do you know Wild Mountain Thyme?" The band members nodded almost immediately. It was a classic folk song, simple and beautiful, one that almost any Celtic band would know by heart. "Of course," the fiddler said. The woman turned back toward her table and raised her arms like a victorious athlete. Her friends cheered even louder. And suddenly something strange happened. The loud table, the same people who had been shouting, laughing, heckling, and talking through every song, became completely quiet. Every single one of them. They leaned forward with proud smiles, ready to listen to their friends sing. It was almost impressive how quickly they switched from chaos to silence. The guitarist gently strummed the opening chords. The fiddle followed softly. The room fell quiet. Even the other guests seemed curious now. Would she actually be able to sing? I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed, watching carefully. And then she began. Her voice came clear, steady, and surprisingly beautiful. "Oh, the summertime is coming." The melody floated through the room with surprising warmth. For a brief second, I forgot about everything else. She was actually good, really good. The band supported her perfectly, the fiddle weaving gently around her voice. Even Mark leaned toward me and whispered quietly, Okay, I didn't expect that. I nodded slowly. Neither did I. For a brief moment, the entire room listened peacefully. But as I looked over at the loud table again, the irritation returned. They sat there with proud smiles, completely quiet now, enjoying the music. The same people who had ruined every other song were suddenly acting like perfect listeners. Something about that bothered me more than anything else they had done earlier. It meant they knew how to behave, they just didn't care when it wasn't about them. I felt the frustration building again. They had heckled the band, talked over songs, shouted random comments, laughed loudly through quiet ballads, and now they expected the whole room to respectfully listen to their performance. I stared at the stage. The woman continued singing beautifully. And we'll all go together. Her friend.
We stepped out of the pub into the cool night air, and the door closed behind us with a dull wooden thud. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then Mark burst out laughing. Not the quiet chuckle he had been holding in earlier, but full, uncontrollable laughter that echoed down the quiet street. Jason joined him almost immediately. "You are insane," Mark said between laughs, pointing at me. "Absolutely insane." I shrugged, trying to act calm, though I could feel the leftover adrenaline buzzing through my chest. "Well," I said, "someone had to say it." Jason wiped his eyes. "I thought that guy at their table was about to punch you." "Yeah," Mark agreed. "When he stood up like that, I was already planning my escape route." We started walking slowly down the sidewalk. The pub sat on a corner street lined with old brick buildings and dim streetlights. A few cars passed occasionally, their headlights sliding across the pavement. Behind us, the pub looked calm again. Music faintly leaked through the walls. For a moment, I wondered if the band had continued playing right after we left. "They probably went back to being loud again," Jason said, as if reading my thoughts. "Probably," I replied. But strangely, I didn't feel angry anymore. Earlier that night, sitting in that room while they heckled the band, I had been furious. Now the anger had drained away. All that remained was a quiet sense of satisfaction. Not because I had ruined someone's performance, she really had been a good singer, but because for one brief moment, the loud table had experienced their own behavior reflected back at them. Mark stretched his arms as we walked. "Well," he said, "that was definitely not the relaxing music night we planned." Jason laughed again. "No," he said, "but it was way more entertaining." We reached the end of the block and stopped near a small diner that was still open. Bright fluorescent lights spilled out through the windows, illuminating the empty parking lot. "Food?" Mark suggested. None of us had eaten much earlier, and suddenly the smell of fries drifting through the diner's door sounded pretty appealing. "Yeah," I said, "let's grab something." We walked inside and took a booth near the window. The diner was quiet, just a couple of late-night customers and a tired-looking waitress wiping down the counter. Compared to the chaos in the pub, the silence felt almost surreal. The waitress brought us menus. "What can I get you guys?" she asked. "Coffee," Jason said immediately. "And fries," Mark added. "Lots of fries." We ordered a few simple things and settled into the booth. For a few minutes, we just sat there, letting the evening settle. Then Mark leaned forward again. "I still can't believe you actually did that," he said. "Did what?" "You basically turned into them." Jason nodded. "Exactly. You became the loud drunk table." I shrugged. "Only for one song." Mark shook his head slowly. "I thought you were just joking when you said, 'Watch this.'" "Well, they were quiet for her song, weren't they?" Jason laughed. "Yeah, that part was hilarious." He leaned back and stretched. "You should have seen the look on that guy's face when you said, 'Sucks when you can't hear the music.'" Mark nearly spit out his drink laughing. "Oh man, that was brutal." I smiled slightly. It really had been the perfect moment. But as we continued talking about it, something unexpected happened. The diner door opened, and 3 familiar faces walked in. The laughter at our table stopped instantly. Mark slowly turned his head toward the entrance. Jason did the same. I followed their gaze.
Standing near the door were 3 people from the loud table at the pub. For a split second, none of us moved. They recognized us immediately. Of course they did. One of them, the guy who had almost stood up earlier, locked eyes with me. The tension in the room tightened like a pulled wire. Mark muttered quietly, "Well, this could get interesting." The 3 people walked slowly toward the counter. They didn't say anything to us, but every few seconds one of them glanced toward our booth. Jason whispered under his breath, "Okay, maybe we should leave." I shook my head slightly. "Relax," I said quietly, but honestly, I wasn't completely relaxed. Drunk people with hurt pride can be unpredictable. The waitress returned with our food. Plates of fries and sandwiches landed on the table. For a few minutes, we focused on eating, pretending nothing unusual was happening, but the 3 people at the counter kept glancing over. Finally, one of them stood up. It was the same guy who had nearly confronted us earlier. He walked slowly toward our booth. Mark sighed quietly. "Here we go." The guy stopped beside our table. Up close, he looked less intimidating than he did earlier. Still annoyed, but not furious. He crossed his arms. "You guys left the pub pretty quick," he said. His voice wasn't aggressive, just curious. I met his eyes calmly. "Yeah," I said. "Didn't want to start a fight." He nodded slowly. "That's fair." For a second, none of us spoke. Then something surprising happened. The guy smiled slightly. "You know," he said, "that was kind of a dick move." Jason opened his mouth, but I answered first. "Yeah," I said, "it was." The guy chuckled. "But," he continued, "I guess we kind of deserved it." That caught all of us off guard. Mark blinked. "Wait, seriously?" The guy shrugged. "We were pretty loud." Jason leaned forward. "Pretty loud?" he repeated. "You guys heckled every song." The man laughed again. "Okay, yeah, that's fair." He rubbed the back of his neck. "In our defense," he said, "we'd been drinking since like 2 in the afternoon." "That explains a lot," Mark muttered. The guy nodded. "Yeah, not our proudest moment." Then he looked directly at me again. "But when you started shouting for her song," he said, "that was actually kind of genius." Jason burst out laughing. "I told you," he pointed at me. Mark shook his head slowly. "I still thought we were about to get punched." The man laughed again. "Nah, well, maybe Carl would have tried something." "Carl?" I asked. "The big guy who stood up earlier." "Ah," Mark said. "Yeah, he looked ready." The grin grinned. "He's all talk." We relaxed a little. The tension that had filled the diner slowly disappeared. "So," the guy continued, "just so you know, after you left, our table actually shut up for the rest of the night." Jason's eyebrows shot up. "Seriously?" "Yup." Mark leaned back in his seat. "Well," he said, "mission accomplished." The man nodded. "Honestly," he admitted, "the band probably appreciated it too." "I hope so," I smiled. The man stepped back from the booth. "Well, enjoy your food, and next time maybe just throw a napkin at us or something." Jason laughed. "Deal." The man returned to the counter where his friends were waiting. Our booth stayed quiet for a moment. Then Mark shook his head slowly. "I did not expect this ending." "Me neither," Jason agreed. I took another bite of fries. "Sometimes," I said, "people just need a mirror." "A mirror?" Jason asked. "Yeah, so they can see what they actually look like." Mark smiled. "Well, you definitely held up the mirror tonight." We finished our food slowly, the tension completely gone now. Outside, the street had grown quieter, and somewhere down the street, the Irish pub probably continued playing music. But one thing was almost certain. For the rest of that night, the rowdy table probably listened a little more carefully than before. After we finished eating, the tension from earlier had almost completely disappeared. The fries were gone, our coffee cups were nearly empty, and the diner had grown even quieter than before. The 3 people from the pub were still sitting at the counter, but now the atmosphere felt different. Instead of glaring at us like enemies, they were chatting casually with the waitress and occasionally laughing amongst themselves. Mark leaned back in the booth and stretched his arms. "Well," he said, "that could have gone a lot worse than it did." Jason nodded. I was already picturing chairs flying across the diner. I laughed quietly. Honestly, I thought the same thing when that guy walked over. Mark pointed his fork at me. Yeah, but you handled it pretty smoothly. Jason smirked. You basically told him, yeah, I was a jerk, but you deserved it. I shrugged. Well, it was the truth. For a few moments, we sat there in comfortable silence, the strange night finally starting to feel like just another story we'd laugh about later. But as we got ready to leave, something unexpected happened again. The diner door opened, cold night air drifted inside, and two more familiar faces walked in. Mark blinked. No way! Jason turned toward the door. You've got to be kidding me. Standing there were two of the musicians from the pub, the fiddler and the guitarist. They looked tired but relaxed, still carrying their instrument cases. It seemed they had finished their performance for the night and had come looking for late-night food just like we had. For a moment, they didn't notice us. They walked to the counter and greeted the waitress. But then the guitarist glanced across the room and immediately recognized us. His eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise. He leaned toward the fiddler and whispered something. The fiddler turned his head. Then both of them smiled. Oh boy, Mark muttered quietly. Here comes round two. The musicians walked over to our booth. The guitarist stopped beside the table and rested his instrument case against the wall. Well, he said with a friendly grin, I didn't expect to see you guys here. I smiled awkwardly. Late night food. Same here, he replied. The fiddler chuckled. Quite a night back there. Jason coughed nervously. Yeah.
For the next few days, the night at the Irish pub became one of those stories that refused to die. At first, it was just something we laughed about among ourselves. Every time our group met for coffee or dinner, someone eventually brought it up again. Usually Mark. He seemed especially proud of the moment when the entire rowdy table realized they had been outplayed. You should have seen their faces, he kept saying. It was like someone turned on a light in their brains. Jason would always laugh and add, yeah, the loudmouth line was the best part. But the funny thing about good stories is that they rarely stay contained to the original group of people who experience them. Stories travel. And this one started traveling faster than we expected. About a week later, Mark texted me a screenshot of something. It was a social media post. At first glance, it looked like a simple post from the Irish pub's page. They often posted photos of live performances, announcements about upcoming bands, or small updates about drink specials. But this post was different. The title of the post said, "The Night the Crowd Got Schooled." Underneath the title was a short story describing a recent performance. They didn't use names, but it was clearly about the same night. The post described a loud group that had been heckling musicians during a Celtic folk performance. It explained how the room had become uncomfortable for everyone else until one audience member decided to demonstrate the problem in a very direct way, by loudly talking during the loud group's friend's song, and finishing with a perfectly timed line about how frustrating it is when loudmouths ruin the music. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I started laughing. The musicians must have told the pub staff about it, or maybe someone in the audience had mentioned it afterward. Either way, the story had become pub folklore. Mark called me immediately. Did you see it? He asked. I just read it. Jason joined the call a minute later. They turned it into a legend, he said. Apparently, I replied. The funniest part was the comment section under the post. People were sharing their own stories about loud bar crowds. Some were joking about how every music venue needs a designated loudmouth corrector. One comment said, "Whoever that guy was, he deserves free drinks." Jason laughed so hard he almost choked. See? You're famous now. I shook my head. I don't want fame for yelling in a pub. But secretly, I had to admit it was pretty funny. For about a week, that post kept getting shared locally. Friends of friends started asking Mark about it. A couple of people even asked if he knew who the mystery revenge talker was. He never confirmed anything.
He just enjoyed the story growing bigger every time it was retold. But the story still wasn't finished. About 3 weeks later, something unexpected happened. Mark called me again one afternoon. "You busy tonight?" he asked. "Not really. Why?" "The Celtic band is playing again." "At the same pub?" "Yep." I laughed. "And you want to go back?" "Of course," Mark said. "We need to see if the legend continues." Jason was immediately interested too. "Imagine if the loud table shows up again." "That would be incredible," Mark said. Part of me wasn't sure if returning was a good idea, but curiosity won. A few hours later, we were walking toward the same Irish pub again. The decorations had changed slightly. Most of the St. Patrick's Day decorations were gone now, but the pub still had its usual cozy atmosphere. When we walked in, the place was already busier than last time. Apparently, the band had become a popular act at this location. We walked toward the music room and immediately noticed something surprising. The musicians recognized us. The guitarist looked up from the stage while tuning his instrument. His eyes widened slightly. Then he grinned. "Well, well," he said into the microphone. "Look who just walked in." Mark froze. "Oh no," he whispered. The fiddler leaned toward the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special guest tonight." Jason buried his face in his hands. I just stood there, confused. The guitarist continued. "You may have heard the story about the night someone taught a loud crowd a lesson." The room chuckled. Mark slowly turned toward me. "You are never going to live this down." The guitarist pointed toward our table. "That gentleman right there." Half the room turned to look. I immediately felt my face getting warm. Jason started laughing uncontrollably. The guitarist smiled. "Don't worry, we won't make you sing." The room laughed again. "Unless you want to." I shook my head quickly. "No thanks." Mark leaned toward me. "You realize this is your villain origin story." Jason added, "Or your hero origin story." We sat down at a table while the musicians continued joking about the situation. But what happened next was even stranger. Halfway through the first set, the door opened again. And guess who walked in? The same loud table from the original night, all of them. For a moment, the entire room seemed to freeze. They spotted us almost immediately. Then they looked at the stage. The musicians looked back at them. The guitarist slowly smiled. "Well, this is interesting." Mark whispered, "Oh, this is going to be good." The loud table walked toward a table, but something was different this time. They didn't drag tables together. They didn't shout. They didn't laugh loudly. They sat down quietly. The woman who had sung that night even gave us a small, embarrassed wave. Jason leaned toward me. "I think you traumatized them." Mark chuckled. "Or educated them." The musicians started the next song, and this time, the entire room stayed quiet. No heckling, no shouting, no loud conversations, just music. For the first time since we had started coming to that pub, the band played an entire set without a single interruption. And halfway through the song, the guitarist looked toward our table and gave a small, approving nod. Mark leaned toward me. "Look what you started." Jason grinned. "You accidentally improved the pub." I laughed quietly. Maybe that was true. But the night wasn't over yet, because by the end of the performance, something even more surprising was about to happen. Something that none of us could have predicted when we first walked into that pub weeks earlier. The music continued, smooth and steady, filling the room with the warm sound of fiddle and guitar. The atmosphere was completely different from the chaos of the first night we had come here. This time, the room felt calm. People were listening, really listening. No loud conversations, no heckling, no random shouting across tables, just quiet conversations between songs and respectful applause when each piece ended. Even the group that had once dominated the room sat quietly at their table. Every now and then, someone at their table would laugh softly or whisper something to another person, but they kept their voices low. Mark leaned toward me during the middle of one song. "You realize what you did, right?" "What?" "You trained them." Jason smirked. "Like behavior correction." I shook my head, smiling. I doubt it was that dramatic. But honestly, it did feel a little strange. The same group that had once been the loudest people in the room now looked like the most careful listeners. The woman who had sung that night sat quietly with her drink, occasionally nodding along to the music. At one point, she even clapped enthusiastically when the fiddler finished a complicated solo. Jason noticed it too. "Look at that," he whispered. "She's actually enjoying the music now." Mark nodded. "Character development." I laughed quietly. The band finished the song, and the room applauded warmly. The guitarist stepped up to the microphone. "All right, everyone, break's over." People started returning to their tables. The group from the loud table stood up, but before they walked away, the woman turned back to us. "You know," she said, "there's one thing we never did." "What's that?" Mark asked. She smiled. "Properly introduce ourselves." She pointed to herself. "I'm Claire." The man beside her. "I'm Ryan." One by one, the others introduced themselves. Then Mark introduced our group. When they finished, Claire grinned. "Well," she said, "nice to meet the guy who publicly shamed us into better behavior." Jason burst out laughing. "Best introduction ever." Claire pointed toward the stage. "All right, we're going to sit down before you start shouting again." "Don't tempt me," I said. Her group returned to their table. The musicians started the next song, and this time,
The second set continued smoothly. The musicians seemed even more relaxed now, and the room had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Every song flowed into the next one, while the audience listened quietly, clapping and cheering at the right moments. Claire's group stayed calm at their table. No shouting, no heckling, just smiles, and the occasional whisper between songs. Jason leaned toward me during one of the faster fiddle tunes. "You see that?" he whispered. "What?" "They're on their best behavior." Mark smirked. "Fear is a powerful teacher." I rolled my eyes. "They're not scared." Jason shrugged. "Maybe not scared, but definitely careful." Across the room, Claire noticed us watching and raised her glass toward our table with a playful grin. Mark returned the gesture. The atmosphere now felt friendly, almost like everyone in the room shared the same inside joke. The band finished another song, and the guitarist stepped forward. "Thank you," he said, smiling at the crowd. Applause filled the room. He waited for it to quiet down before continuing. "You know," he said, "we've been playing in this pub for a long time." The fiddler nodded beside him. "Many years. And we've seen a lot of interesting nights." The audience chuckled. Mark leaned toward me. "This sounds suspicious." The guitarist continued. "But a few weeks ago," he said, "something happened that we've been talking about ever since." The room laughed again. Jason slowly turned his head toward me. "Oh no." The guitarist pointed gently toward our table again. "Some of you may have heard the story already." Claire's group started clapping and cheering. Mark whispered, "You're doomed." I buried my face in my hands. The guitarist laughed. "Don't worry," he said, "we won't embarrass anyone too much." The fiddler leaned into the microphone. "But we thought tonight might be a good opportunity to celebrate something." "Celebrate what?" Jason whispered. The guitarist raised his hand. "Tonight," he said, "we celebrate the power of music and the importance of listening." The audience applauded. Then he smiled again. "And we thought maybe we'd invite a couple volunteers to help us with the next song." Mark instantly pointed at me. "Not him." The crowd laughed. Claire stood up from her table. "Oh no," she called out playfully, "he definitely should." Her friends cheered. Jason slapped the table. "Yes!" I shook my head quickly. "No chance." But the guitarist wasn't finished. "How about this?" he said. "Since this whole story started with someone joining us on stage," he pointed toward Claire, "maybe we should continue the tradition."
The room clapped loudly. Claire laughed nervously. "Wait, what?" The fiddler grinned. "You did great last time." Her friends immediately started chanting her name. "Claire! Claire! Claire!" She looked back at them in disbelief. "You guys are the worst." Mark whispered to me, "This is amazing." Claire hesitated for a moment, then sighed dramatically. "Fine," she said. The room cheered as she walked toward the stage again. When she reached the microphone, the guitarist smiled. "Welcome back." Claire shook her head. "I should have stayed home tonight." Jason leaned toward me. "This is your fault." The guitarist tuned his guitar briefly. "So," he said, "same song as last time?" Claire laughed. "No way." The fiddler spoke up. "How about something fun?" Claire thought for a moment. Then she looked out at the audience. "All right," she said, "but I need help." The guitarist raised an eyebrow. "Help?" Claire pointed directly at our table. "From him." Every head in the room turned toward me again. Jason fell out of his chair laughing. Mark grabbed my arm. "You have to do it." "No," I said firmly. Claire crossed her arms on stage. "Come on," she said. "Fair is fair." The audience started clapping. "Do it! Do it!" I stared at the floor. This had escalated far beyond anything I expected. The guitarist laughed. "Looks like the crowd is decided." Jason pushed my shoulder. "Go!" Mark added, "You started this." Claire pointed at the stair steps. "Your turn." I sighed heavily. Everyone in the room watched as I slowly stood up. The applause grew louder. Jason was laughing so hard he could barely breathe. Mark followed me halfway to the stage. "I'm not missing this," he said. When I reached the stage, the guitarist handed me a small tambourine. "That's your instrument," he said. I stared at it. "You're kidding." "Nope." Claire leaned toward the microphone. "This is perfect." The fiddler tapped his bow against the strings. "Ready?" I shook the tambourine awkwardly. "I have no idea what I'm doing." "That's fine," the guitarist said. "We're professionals." The audience laughed. Claire leaned toward me. "Just follow the rhythm." The band started playing a lively Irish folk tune. The fiddle danced through the melody while the guitar kept a steady beat. Claire began singing confidently again. Her voice filled the room beautifully, and I stood beside her on stage, shaking a tambourine like a confused tourist. The audience clapped along with the rhythm. Jason and Mark were practically crying with laughter at our table. Halfway through the song, Claire leaned toward me and whispered, "You realize this is the most ridiculous revenge story ever." I laughed. "Agreed." The song ended with a burst of applause. The guitarist raised his hand dramatically. "Ladies and gentlemen, the Loudmouth Correction Team." The entire room cheered. I handed the tambourine back quickly. "Never again." Claire laughed as we stepped off the stage. When we returned to our table, Jason immediately stood up and hugged me. "You absolute legend." Mark wiped tears from his eyes. That was worth coming back for. Claire returned to her table smiling, and as the band started their final set of the night, one thing was clear. What had started as a simple moment of petty revenge had now turned into one of the funniest nights anyone in that pub would probably remember for a long time. But the story still wasn't finished, because before the night ended, something would happen that would turn this strange little story into a permanent tradition at the pub. When I finally returned to our table after the stage performance, my face was still warm from embarrassment and laughter. Jason was practically falling out of his chair, clutching his stomach. "I cannot believe that just happened," he said between laughs. Mark wiped his eyes. "You started the night as the revenge guy. Now you're the tambourine player." I shook my head. "I regret everything." Across the room, Claire's group was still laughing too. Claire lifted her glass toward us again, clearly enjoying the whole situation. The band began their final set of the night. The energy in the room felt even better than before. The earlier tension from weeks ago was completely gone. Instead, the entire pub seemed to share a strange sense of unity. People clapped along with the songs. Some even quietly sang the choruses when they recognized the lyrics. And every once in a while, someone would glance toward our table and smile, remembering what had just happened on stage. Jason leaned toward me again. "You realize everyone in here now thinks you're part of the show." Great, I muttered. Mark laughed. Next time, bring your own tambourine. The final set passed quickly. Song after song filled the room with music, laughter, and applause. When the band finally reached their last song, the guitarist stepped forward to the microphone again. All right, everyone, one last tune before we call it a night. The audience clapped. They played a fast, cheerful folk song that had people tapping their feet under the tables. Even some of the older couples near the stage were smiling and gently swaying with the rhythm. When the final note ended, the room erupted in loud applause. People stood up, cheering and clapping. The band bowed slightly. "Thank you all for a wonderful night," the guitarist said. Then he added something unexpected. "And special thanks to our guest percussionist." The audience laughed again. Jason pointed at me proudly. "Take a bow." I shook my head, trying to disappear into my chair. But the night wasn't over. As people began standing up and gathering their coats, a tall man stepped out from behind the bar area and walked into the music room. Mark recognized him first. "That's the owner," he whispered. The owner was a big guy with gray hair and a friendly face. He clapped his hands loudly to get everyone's attention. "All right, folks," he said, "before you all head out, I just want to say something." The room quieted. He pointed toward the band. "First, let's thank these guys for another great performance." Everyone clapped again. Then he crossed his arms and smiled. "But I also want to mention something that's been happening here recently." Mark slowly turned toward me. "Oh, no." The owner continued. "A few weeks ago, we had an interesting moment during one of these performances." Laughter spread through the room. Claire's group started cheering. The owner pointed toward our table. "And tonight, we saw the continuation of that moment." Jason whispered, "You're famous now." The owner chuckled. "I've been running this pub for 15 years, and I've seen all kinds of nights." He paused for dramatic effect. "But I've never seen someone teach an entire room how to behave using a tambourine and a loud voice." The audience burst into laughter. My face felt even warmer. The owner raised his hands. "So I had an idea." That got everyone's attention. He continued, "From now on, once a month, we're going to host something special." Jason leaned closer. "What kind of special?" The owner smiled widely. "We're calling it the Listening Night." People looked at each other curiously. The owner explained, "It's simple. On Listening Night, the music comes first. No heckling, no shouting over songs, no acting like the band is background noise." He paused. "But if someone forgets that rule," the room leaned in.
A month passed surprisingly quickly. Life went back to normal for a while. Workdays, errands, the usual routine. But every once in a while, the story from the Irish pub would come up again in conversation. Mark would bring it up whenever we met for coffee. Jason would mention it whenever someone talked about live music, and every time it came up, the same sentence followed. "Listening night is coming." The owner had posted about it on the pub's social media page a couple weeks after our last visit. The post announced the first official listening night, and it included a simple explanation of the rule. Respect the music, or you might end up on stage. The post spread quickly around the local community. People thought it was hilarious. Some commented that they were excited to see it happen. Others joked about bringing their loud friends just to see them forced to perform. Mark showed me the post the day it appeared. "Look," he said proudly, pointing at his phone. "You started this." Jason laughed. "This might be the most entertaining social experiment ever." When the day finally arrived, we all agreed to go back. But this time, things felt different even before we walked in. As we approached the pub that evening, we could already see that it was busier than usual. The parking lot was almost full. Jason stared at the crowd near the entrance. "Whoa." Mark nodded. "Looks like half the town came." Apparently, the idea of listening night had attracted a lot of curiosity. We stepped inside and immediately felt the buzz of excitement. The pub was packed. Both the bar room and the music room were full of people chatting, laughing, and waiting for the music to start. But something interesting stood out right away. Even though the place was crowded, the atmosphere still felt controlled.
People were talking, of course, but not shouting, almost like everyone remembered the rule. Jason whispered, "This is already working." Mark pointed toward the music room. "Let's grab a table before they're gone." We managed to find a small table near the middle of the room, the same area where we had sat during the very first night weeks ago. The band was already setting up on stage. The same musicians. The fiddler noticed us almost immediately. He smiled and waved. Jason laughed. "They remember you." I sighed. "Of course they do." The guitarist stepped up to the microphone. "Good evening, everyone." The room quieted quickly. "Welcome to our very first official listening night." Applause filled the room. He continued, "For those who are new here, the rules are simple." He raised one finger. "Respect the music." Then he raised another, "And if you forget, you might get invited up here to perform." The crowd laughed loudly. Mark leaned toward me. "This is going to be fun." The guitarist pointed toward the back of the room. "And tonight, we even have a few special guests." Jason looked confused. "Special guests?" The guitarist grinned. "You may remember the gentleman who inspired this entire idea." Slowly, Mark turned toward me. "Oh no," Jason whispered. "Here we go again." The guitarist pointed directly at our table. The room erupted with cheers and laughter. I buried my face in my hands again. The fiddler added, "Don't worry, we promised we wouldn't make him play tambourine tonight." Jason shouted, "That's disappointing." The room laughed again. The guitarist raised his hands. "All right, let's start the music." The band launched into their first song, a fast Celtic tune that immediately filled the room with energy. People tapped their feet, some clapped along. But just like the owner had hoped, everyone listened. The sound of conversation faded once the music started. For the first few songs, everything went perfectly. Mark leaned toward me after one tune ended. "I'm actually impressed." Jason nodded. "No loud tables yet." But then, about halfway through the set, the door opened and a new group walked in. 5 people, already laughing loudly, already talking at full volume. Jason noticed them first. "Oh boy." Mark turned around to look. "Looks like trouble." The group grabbed a table near the back of the room. At first, they didn't seem to notice the quiet atmosphere. One guy told a loud story that made his friends burst into laughter. Several people in the room glanced over. The band kept playing, but the loud table kept talking. The volume of their conversation grew. They weren't being mean, they just clearly didn't understand the situation. Jason whispered, "They have no idea." Mark smiled slowly. "They're about to learn." The guitarist finished the song and stepped to the microphone. "Thank you." Applause filled the room again. Then he looked toward the back of the room, specifically at the loud table. The entire audience followed his gaze. The group slowly realized everyone was looking at them. One guy raised an eyebrow. "What?" The guitarist smiled politely. "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we have our first volunteers for listening night." The entire room erupted with laughter and applause. Jason slapped the table. "This is happening." The loud group looked confused. "What volunteers?" one woman asked. The fiddler stepped forward. "Don't worry, it's part of the show." The guitarist added, "You get to join us for the next song." The entire pub cheered again. The loud group looked at each other nervously. One guy pointed at himself. "Us?" The guitarist nodded. "Just one of you." The audience started chanting again. "Do it! Do it! Do it!" Jason leaned toward me. "This is exactly how your story started." Mark grinned. "The tradition continues." After a few seconds of hesitation, one of the guys from the loud table stood up. "Well, all right," he said nervously. The audience applauded as he walked toward the stage. He looked back at his friends. "You're all terrible people." They laughed and cheered him on. When he reached the stage, the guitarist handed him a tambourine. Jason nearly fell out of his chair, laughing. Mark whispered, "History repeats itself." The man looked at the tambourine in disbelief. "You're kidding." The fiddler smiled. "Nope." The band started playing a cheerful folk tune. The new volunteer began shaking the tambourine awkwardly. The crowd clapped along with the rhythm. His friends laughed loudly, but this time in a supportive way. and within seconds, the entire pub was laughing, clapping, and enjoying the moment together. Jason leaned toward me again. "You see what you started?" Mark nodded proudly. "This place will never be the same again." And as the tambourine echoed through the room, one thing became very clear. Listening night was going to become a permanent tradition, because sometimes the best way to remind people to respect the music is to invite them to become part of it. But the night still had one more surprise waiting, because before the final song ended, someone unexpected was about to return to the stage. By the time the final set of the first official listening night rolled around, the pub had transformed into something magical. The music room was buzzing with energy, but it was the kind of energy that came from shared enjoyment, not chaos. Everyone clapped in rhythm, swayed to the tunes, and smiled at each other like they were part of some secret club. The first volunteer, our poor tambourine friend from the loud table, had finished his song, and now the room had settled again. People were still talking quietly among themselves, but every once in a while, a laugh would ripple through the room, usually at the expense of some playful jab from the musicians. Mark nudged me. "You realize this is your legacy now, right?" Jason was already grinning. "The guy who started listening night. Oh, grown. It's not even my idea. It was revenge that got out of control." Mark laughed. "Exactly. You accidentally created a public service announcement in the form of a bar tradition." The band launched into another lively tune. The fiddler's bow danced across the strings, the guitarist kept the beat steady, and the drummer added small percussive accents. The music filled the room, and everyone clapped along. It was then, during the middle of the song, that something caught my eye. At the back of the room, the original rowdy group, the very ones who had started all this months ago, had arrived. They weren't quiet this time. They had clearly been warned because their laughter was controlled and their voices lower, but they were smiling broadly and clearly enjoying themselves. Claire and Ryan had dragged some friends with them, and they were eagerly waiting to see what would happen. Mark nudged me. "Oh no, here we go again." Jason whispered, "This is about to get interesting." The song ended, and the guitarist took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special moment for the finale tonight." The audience leaned in. "Because this is the very first official listening night, we thought it would be fun to do something a little different." He gestured toward the original rowdy group. "And we'd like to invite some special guests back onto the stage." A wave of laughter and applause filled the room. Claire's eyes widened in mock horror. "Oh no," she muttered. Ryan groaned. "Not again." But before anyone could react, the guitarist started calling names, one by one. Everyone from that original rowdy group had to come up to the stage. This time, instead of just the tambourine, they each were assigned a small percussion instrument, shakers, tambourines, and small hand drums. Jason slapped the table. "This is happening." Mark laughed. "This is going to be glorious. I cannot believe this is happening again." The band started their final song, a lively, chaotic, upbeat tune. The stage quickly became a whirlwind of sound. Instruments rattled, shook, and jangled as each member of the original rowdy group tried to keep up. Some followed the rhythm, some didn't, and some just laughed so hard they almost forgot to play. The audience roared with laughter and clapping. Even the newcomers were clapping along, egging the performers on. Claire leaned toward me with a whisper. "I never thought I'd enjoy being embarrassed on stage this much." I laughed. Neither did I. The song reached its climax, and the musicians began a playful call and response